It's a real pleasure to be here today to present, along with Jim Lewis, our paper entitled Beyond Economics, How U.S. Policies Can Undermine U.S. National Security Goals. I should note the paper was released about 2 minutes ago, and so you can get it on our website. Click on there and you'll get the whole thing. What we're going to do this morning is Jim and I are going to present the paper, and then we've got two very distinguished panelists that I will introduce in a little bit that we're going to talk to about this and to get their reaction to the paper, and then we have some questions to get their advice on what the issues are that we should be further researching. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk about what our findings were and what our research was.
So I'll just talk briefly, and I'd like to thank the people, Thibault and Taylor, who actually did the bulk of the work on the report and deserve, therefore, the bulk of the credit. But
so they really should be here instead of us.
And I'm happy to change places if they'd like, but you have to get a tie. So one of the things that I think people are slowly realizing is the nature of conflict, particularly great power conflict. Well, I'm a think tank, so I can say that, has changed remarkably in the last 20 years. And it's less how good you are at building the weapons of the 20th century and more, at least in terms of the competition with the US and China, how well your economy performs, how well you are at creating new technologies, how well you do at innovation. So that's what the report's about, because we felt there was a disconnect between some of the policies being pursued by the federal government and what we think is required for success in this competition. Let me talk about 4 questions that the report addresses. The first is, what is the best way to create new technologies? The US leads in this now, so when I see some of the antitrust efforts, I wonder what they're trying to do. You could say we could do better or this isn't sustainable, but it's been sustainable for decades that the US has led in creating new technologies. And so it makes me nervous, and I think the report gets into this in detail. It makes me nervous to say we're going to take the winning car and rebuild it in the middle of the race. What does competition with China require? Technology is easy to cite as a source of power, and it is, but it's not a direct source of power in most cases. And the Chinese have, learning from us, decided that building a strong innovation base based on a non-market economy, based on Xi Jinping's affinity for Marxism, building that strong tech base gives them military power, economic power, and political influence in the world. And of those 3, I'd say the economic power is the most important. We tend to forget that Europeans have learned it well. Don't have a strong economy, you have a hard time creating your influence in other places. So competition with China requires, and I think this is the opening theme of the report, requires a strong tech base in the US. How do we get that? And there's really a fundamental dispute here. I think it's in some ways ideological, that there's the lessons that antitrust and disruptive economics pose, which would be to go after leading tech companies. And then there's the sense that we have tech giants, we have national champions, and we should do what we can to strengthen them. That's certainly what the Chinese do. And there's arguments on both sides, so I think the paper is relatively balanced in going through them. What is the role of the state? This is a hard one. And so for many years, as you all know, saying the words industrial policy in Washington was a verboten. It was not allowed. And now we can't say industrial policy anymore. We say industrial strategy. That will trick them. But the role of the state in promoting technological leadership and economic growth is the subject here and of much of the work. What is the state going to do? China has a very clear notion. It's directive, it's China incorporated, it's based on earlier models from the Soviet Union, which Xi Jinping pines for some reason. We have different views, but there is a dispute now, and we felt that there's different views within the administration, some of which argue for one approach to building innovation, some of which resist that. And our view is very much that disrupting the tech economy at this time might not be such a good idea in the contest with China. And that'll be my final comment. What's the timeline for the contest here? If this was 15 years ago and we were in the state of happy bliss of thinking we and the Chinese would be friends, we could probably afford an experiment in antitrust in dismantling big tech companies. If we were not in a contest that is growing more intense every month, we could afford to dismantle tech giants. So a lot of it is the timeline. There's good research, starting with Schumpeter, on the benefits of disrupting, of creative destruction over the long term. And so what we do now in terms of changing the balance of economic power, going after national champions, having states pick winners, that could, in the long term, provide economic benefit. That's been the case for more than a century, right? In the near term, though, in a war, or what seems to be approaching a war, and that's a little gloomy, I apologize, but there's a different debate about, are we in the 1930s or are we in the 1960s? Putting that aside, we may not have the time. It may be hubristic to think we have the time to afford to dismantle the world's best innovation machine, on the grounds that it should perform better if we do that. And I think the report does a good job of working through the national security implications, the economic implications, some of the legal and regulatory implications. So the price is right. If you go to our website, I encourage you to take a look at it.
Yes, Friday discount, absolutely free. Let me pick up for a few minutes on where Jim left off, and then we'll turn to our panel for comments. I think he used a wonderful, he referred to Schumpeter, and it really, the paper really is in a way about Schumpeterian creative destruction. But I think one of the other things we have to do, think about in addition to the timelines that Jim talked about, is about the competitive context in which we operate. It's one thing at the end of the 19th century to break up Standard Oil and then end up with a number of separate American companies, break up AT&T and end up with a number of American companies. The competition that the paper talks about, the competition that Jim talked about, is in a global context. So we have to think about not only is what is going to happen to the nature of domestic competition, but how is that going to be impacted by international competition. And the high-tech companies that are our heroes, our champions, compete daily and vigorously with, among other things, Chinese companies that are technology leaders in China and are working very, very hard to become global technology leaders in exactly the critical and emerging areas where we are currently the leaders. So their ambition comes at our expense. And the actions that we take domestically, if taken only for domestic reasons without taking the global context into account, may have long-term negative consequences for our security. So a lot of the paper really focuses on competition policy and discusses the question of, it really is a century-old debate between big, which a lot of people view as by definition old, slow, and stupid, although they didn't get to be big by being old, slow, and stupid, but the argument is that they've ended up that way, and the ones that are young, small, and disruptive, and they will be the innovative future going forward. And as Jim said, Schumpeter makes a good case that over the long term that happens, and over the long term that's right. From a national security perspective, though, we operate in the short term. And a lot of what we have to worry about is what's going to happen between us and China over the next few years. And I think the point of the paper, which is what Jim got directly to, is that it's not clear that we can afford, from a national security perspective, that we can afford the kind of disruption that would normally occur in a sort of a creative destruction mode. The paper also talks about a number of other policies, because the overall title, as I said, was how U.S. policies can undermine national security goals. The biggest one, and I think the most important one, is the one that Jim discussed. But we also get into others that I want to touch on briefly and then close with our recommendations, and then we'll turn to our panelists. One of the biggest ones, which is the failure of Congress to act on a variety of digital trade issues. We don't have a competition policy. We don't have a new one. We don't have a privacy policy. We don't have content moderation policies that are up to date. And Congress hasn't done anything about any of that. The result of that is that we have really ceded the first mover advantage to the EU, which has been very busy regulating in that space, and potentially also to China, which has a very different approach, which they're busy marketing to other countries. By ceding the first mover advantage, we've allowed the EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act essentially to become default positions for companies that operate internationally. These are acts, and we have a separate CSI study on this that we released actually a year ago, that estimated the cost of compliance by U.S. companies simply with the EU regulations, and we estimated those costs as between $22 and $50 billion. And there's separate compliance costs we estimated for European companies that are actually greater than that amount. So our companies have to navigate in that context. They all also have to navigate in the context of conflicting state laws, because as Congress does not act, states do, and they begin to pass their own laws in this space, all of which are different and have different characteristics, which then forces all companies, actually big and small, to try to operate in what's becoming a very complex regulatory environment, where they have standards to meet that are not necessarily conflicting, but which are not the same, and which make it hard for them to develop single approaches to the market. Related to this has been the U.S. Trade Representative's retreat, or policy retreat, on digital issues, particularly on data flows, data localization, and source code disclosure issues. They pulled out of, they didn't pull out, they pulled their positions back at the WTO, where there is a plurilateral process underway to negotiate on those issues. And they have also pulled that section out of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework structure, which led to a failure last November to produce a trade title. Meanwhile, the other three pillars of that were concluded. So that's created a lot of uncertainty. Again, not divided by big and small, but a lot of uncertainty in our emerging technologies industry as to what the government policy is, what it's going to be, and how it's going to affect them, all of which really opens the door to, particularly in third countries, to additional Chinese competition from Huawei and ZTE and numerous other high-tech companies. Jim mentioned industrial policy, which is the second half of my favorite metaphor about China, which is, you know, if you're in a marathon, there's only two ways to win. You run faster, or you trip the other guy. We have U.S. policies that trip the other guy, which I'll get to in a minute, but running faster is, I think, the key to success, and that's really what the paper is about. How do we best increase our own competitiveness? How do we best run faster? The administration's approach has been through the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of which create a variety of incentives to build out, among other things, our critical and emerging technology sector. And that's, I think, something I think that we'll be discussing with the panel a bit later. The way the administration has chosen to do it, which I think will be increasingly subject to scrutiny as it actually gets implemented, raises some issues that need to be addressed. Some of the provisions violate WTO rules, which I care about. I may be the last person in the country that cares about WTO rules.
The last person on the planet.
Yeah, probably the last person at CSIS that does, but I think it's important. It also has irritated our allies, which sometimes we worry about, sometimes we don't, but it risks a subsidy war. And if we get into a subsidy war, that has significant budgetary consequences. at a time when we also already have record deficits. And it really leads over the long term to an import substitution policy, which is what we seem to be pursuing, which history suggests is not really the best way to sustain competitiveness. It's a theory that has in the past applied mostly to developing countries, but we seem to be beginning to apply it to ourselves, and we haven't, I think, really thought through the long-term consequences of doing that. The paper also discusses slow permitting processes in the United States that are going to delay the creation of fab plants and other infrastructure innovations in our economy. Right now, if you're thinking about critical minerals, for example, the average time in the United States from discovery of a deposit to production is 16 and a half years. So if you think the answer to our critical minerals problems is U.S. extraction in the United States, you're going to have a very long wait. I mean, the administration knows that, and that's why they're focusing on looking to other countries for help in that area. But there are some things we could do to speed up that process. We also have a worker shortage. I think one of the most dramatic has been the Taiwan TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, slowing down its plans to build a fab plant in Arizona, among other reasons, because they can't get enough workers. And that is a reminder that we don't really have an immigration policy that speaks to the fact that we don't have a number of workers on many fronts. The Scholl Chair is doing its own project on that subject. We'll have more to say about that later, but I think it's clearly becoming an issue. And then, of course, we maintain export controls and are going to be imposing outbound investment restrictions, which is a reminder that there is always the balance that the government has to pursue between controlling too little, in which case the adversary gets things we don't want it to have, and controlling too much, which means we end up basically kneecapping our own companies by denying them the revenue that they obtain from global sales, which is significant. And we've been walking that line for 50 years. This administration has put some new rules into place that have raised questions about whether they've strayed a little bit too far from the line. That's really a separate topic, but it's discussed in our paper, and I leave it to the rest of you to get the paper, take a look at it. Let me close with our recommendations, of which there are 6, all of which I think the two of us have alluded to. Pass legislation on digital privacy and protect the U.S. competition landscape from a national security perspective, which we argue is not sufficiently taken into account right now. Second one is explicitly build national security considerations into our antitrust analysis, which means the FTC and the Justice Department need to be thinking about national security and not just about domestic market structure as they go forward. Establish fast-track processes in order to set up critically emerging technology-related infrastructure and facilities in the United States. Continue trying to multilateralize economic security measures, which will include looking for a successor regime or a supplementary regime to the existing multilateral export control regimes that we have. Pursuing a more ambitious trade agenda that includes a digital component, which he seemed to have abandoned, and ensuring that industrial policy measures remain compliant with U.S. multilateral commitments, which include WTO rules. So those are the recommendations. That's the paper. And now we want to discuss the paper with some experts who've had a chance to review it in advance. So this is not all brand new for them. And I'm very pleased to have an old friend and a new friend join us. Dorothy Robine is the member of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation's board. Her history is that she served in the Obama administration as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Installations and Environment, and also previous to that as Commissioner of Public Buildings in the General Services Administration. And she served actually along with me in the Clinton administration. There she was Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy at the White House National Economic Council, where she coordinated policy issues related to aviation, aerospace, defense, telecommunications, science, and technology. She's the author of many books and papers, many of which have to do with aviation, which I think is one of the subjects we'll be talking about going forward. She also has been an assistant professor at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a principal with the Brattle Group, which is an economic consultancy, and a guest lecturer at the Brookings Institution. She is joined by Shane Tews, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on digital economy issues, including AI, cybersecurity, privacy and data protection, next-generation networking, 5G, the Internet of Things, international internet governance, international information and communications technology, which is really what we've been talking about this whole time, and emerging technologies. She's also president of Logan Circle Strategies, which is a strategic advisory firm. Previously, she was co-chair of the Internet Governance Forum in the USA, former chair of the Dynamic Coalition on the Internet of Things of the Internet Governance Forum, a member of the board of ITIF, the ITCIC, which is basically the lobbying arm of the ITIF, and the Global Women's Innovation Network. In other words, she's an expert on everything that's going to be important to our economy in the near future. And we're delighted to have both of you with us. And I want to start off with a few questions, and I think Jim and I will chime in and react to what you guys have to say, but we'll start with the two of you. And the first one for each of you is simply, can you comment on the paper? Did we hit the target? Are we off center? Did we miss anything? So who wants to go first? Shane?
So I thought one of the really important pieces is the whole of government that you brought up very early in the paper, is that we need to be looking at this holistically as an administration or as government, and as you noted, we have Congress that's been a bit absent in that. But the fact that we had the USTR step away from cross-border data flows last year, and now we just saw Secretary Raimondo saying that she wants to do cross-border data flows with Kenya in this past week, I'm a little confused. I'm like, are we doing it? Are we not doing it? You know, and the thing that we are really missing in this space is consistency. So that's where the Europeans have seen the hole and have run right through it, which is that we have the lack of consistent regulation. They are being very consistent in their regulation, and lawyers needing consistency in their life like to run towards the regulatory light, even if it's regulating behind the power curve. So I think you've done an excellent job in this paper of really highlighting that that's a huge challenge that we have in front of us.
Dorothy?
I like the fact that you're focused on things that the administration, places where the administration is shooting itself in the foot, basically. If our goal is to prevail in the huge ongoing competition with China, I think that's a very important focus. A lot has been written in this area. I think that's a kind of a unique focus. And I think the paper works best where you go through in the individual sections a list of what those things are. And I would say the digital section on digital competition, digital trade, economic security does that best. There's a very clear delineation of what the administration is doing wrong, or in some cases not doing, particularly in the case of digital. I think where it works less well, and here I'm putting on my former professor hat, it's the message on antitrust does not come through. It's on the one hand, on the other hand, it came through very clearly in Jim's summary. You all have a perspective on this, and you think what the administration is trying to do is wrong. That does not come through in that section or in the section on China, which is kind of almost an addendum to the antitrust section. And the industrial policy section, that's a really interesting section because it is where people like me, who have long argued for an industrial policy by whatever name, technology policy is the name I adopted long ago. We finally got that with chips and science, and it turns out, Bill, you're saying, yeah, but there's some problems in terms of the WTO. I would argue that there's a little bit of an apples and oranges issue in that section. Two of the quote roadblocks that you identify are genuine roadblocks, implementation issues. Lack of workers, I think that's a good thing. I mean, NPR has been covering what's going on in Arizona closely this week, and it's a huge effort to bring on the workers needed to build and staff these huge fabs that are being subsidized through the CHIPS Act. Similarly, the length of time that it takes to build these things. I mean, that's our problem. We need to fix that problem. They can do it much faster in other countries. The WTO thing, that's not a roadblock. You're saying that's an unintended consequence of what we're doing. And I think that's more debatable. So anyway, I think it's overall a very good paper. I think some sections work better than others. Let me say one last thing. The United States has a history of leadership in advanced technology, which is very much your focus on technology and innovation. Where we fall behind is when it comes to manufacturing and production. We lose our leadership advantage to countries that have more sophisticated industrial policies, more patient capital, and who take manufacturing seriously. That has been our problem for decades. And I think incorporating the production piece into this, I think it's why maybe Bill and I would disagree on the CHIPS Act. To me, we are finally doing something to bring production back to the United States. They're doing something seriously. And so I would say looking at production, let me just mention two other things. Under the digital policy, I would mention spectrum. Jim, I know you've done work on spectrum. I have as well. The Biden administration has not pushed to reauthorize the auction authority for the Federal Communication Commission. Spectrum is also an interesting issue because to free up the spectrum that we need for our broadband carriers in particular, you need to go after some of what the Defense Department is sitting on. They can be much more efficient in their use of spectrum if they spend the money on better radars. That's a big fight, but I think that's an important issue as part of the digital.
I think there was a degree of ambivalence in the report, in part because, at least for me, I am somewhat ambivalent on some of these issues. There are antitrust problems when you look at cybersecurity. We've recently had a series of horrendous incidents that some attribute to having a monoculture. The flip side of that, there's two. The first is these big companies spend a lot on R&D. I was at another CSIS event where someone said, we're falling behind China in quantum research, which is true if you look at what DoD is spending. It's not true if you look at what the private sector is spending. We're number one in spending. And the ability to sustain that level of expenditure is one of the reasons I think we came out on this. But there are areas, self-preferencing, privacy, where there's legitimate activities for antitrust. To give you a hilarious example, restaurants in Alexandria made their waitstaff sign a no-compete agreement. So if they left, they were not allowed to go to a competitor. That's completely bonkers. And so the recent FTC action is welcome. But there are places where adding the national security dimension is crucial. The other counterpoint is, and this is one where I think there's an ideological dispute, we know that people from the FTC and Justice have gone to Brussels and have coordinated activities with Brussels. And sometimes you hear people talking about the Brussels effect as if it was a good thing. The Brussels effect, is, as Bill said, is to raise costs and reduce innovation. That part gets left out. And if we copy what the European Union has done, even the Europeans are beginning to say this now. You saw the president of France saying perhaps we've gone too far in regulation. You've seen other senior European leaders. This is the nation, the member states versus Brussels. And right now Brussels is winning, but it's not a path we want to take if we want to maintain ourselves as an innovation leader and as the people bearing the brunt of the competition with China.
Comments? Anybody want to comment on what Jim said, or I got another question, whatever.
Or you can make fun of the European Union,
Yeah, here's an opportunity to attack
Yeah.
the Europeans. I mean,
who have a lot of good qualities, love their food. But anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that watching what the Federal Trade Commission is doing is following the Europeans' lead is a real challenge for us, because we are where innovation comes. When you see, why don't they have innovation in Europe? It's they don't have the capital. And the venture capitalists say they just don't want to do business there. It's too much regulatory entanglement. They don't know, where they can actually get any guidance that will be positive other than possibly fines. So that's what they look at over there. Is the one thing they're doing well is taking money from the companies to give to the government. So Europeans, especially I've met with Italians, they'll say the first thing if we think we have success with a product is we move it immediately outside of Italy to some place where it can get funded. So that's not saying that they're winning in a good way. It means that they're just slowing down progress, which means it's another going to China. China is not doing that to Chinese companies. I think what we haven't thought about is the fact, or not a lot of people have thought about aloud, is the fact that we are going to start having intellectual property challenges by China, since we taught them how to do our work for us. And that was really started in the late 1990s, early 2000s. We thought we would help educate them on a better supply chain management, on our wireless technology and our networking technology. And we now buy everything from China. We don't have, we're having the 5G challenge of only Ericsson and Nokia and a few others coming in, Samsung, trying to be able to fill the gap, to give us some opportunities when it comes to building a trusted network. And it's really our own fault. It's something that we did to ourselves. So that goes back to my initial comment about the whole of government. I think that's one of the important things on the paper, saying we need to think about this not 1 year, or 2 years, or 5 years. We need to be thinking decades. As we're moving into new decades of equipment, we're doing a huge step change in technology. So the software is running everything. It is very easy to infiltrate the software if you don't have the right guidelines and guardrails in place with the technology. And we need the government to help us ensure that, so we aren't just buying products that will eventually be more problematic to us here in the United States.
let's go back to the beginning big picture where Jim began. At the heart of a lot of the policy debate here is around the whole U.S. technology ecosystem. Antitrust, digital competition, industrial policy, the implementation of I guess we're going to call it strategy now, industrial strategy, or we can call it technology, call it whatever you want. We all know what we're talking about. But the question is how technology fits into the broader economic competition with China, which is really what a lot of this paper is about, and it's the challenge, the national challenge we face right now. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how you view the U.S. total tech ecosystem's role in supporting U.S. economic competitiveness and national security?
Maybe two quick footnotes before we go to you guys. First, if you're interested in the effect of European regulation on digital technology, the digital economy, I'd recommend you go to the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which is real economists doing real research that shows that there's a significant increase in cost. Second, we all owe a vote of thanks to Xi Jinping because he's decided he likes Marxism. Even the Chinese are beginning to think, maybe it won't work so well here. So we have some advantages in what I would see as a three-way tech competition. But that doesn't mean we should be dismantling the machine mid-flight.
Yeah. Technology is the critical enabler of military power, economic power. Bill, you will remember when in the George H.W. Bush administration, Michael Boskin, who was the chair of the Council on Economic Advisors, famously said, "Potato chips, computer chips, they're all chips. What's the difference?" That statement, if you go to his wiki page, that's in there. I mean, he could not escape that, and nor did he want to, because doctrinaire economists viewed the world that way. I don't think even the rest of the Bush administration had that view. I don't think the science advisor, Jay Keyworth, had that view, but there was that view. We've come a long ways since then, but I still think, with respect to the ecosystems, I think there isn't a lot of disagreement that technology is the critical enabler. We have always been that has always been our strength, going back to Vannevar Bush and the focus on basic science and mission-oriented R&D. Our problem has been the lack of follow-through, the lack of supporting elements in the ecosystem, including antitrust, manufacturing, taxes, R&D tax credit. And I think, it has been subject to debate over, this country has had a lot of problems with the idea of supporting particular firms or particular sectors or outside of the Department of Defense, which has been our de facto industrial policy. And in particular manufacturing. I remember in that same Bush administration, to meet with people in the administration to talk about manufacturing, and I was on the Joint Economic Committee on the Hill in the late 80s, we had to meet at a neutral territory. We had to find a place, not a federal building, not a executive branch building, because they were talking about manufacturing was so verboten. So there's long been a debate. There's a different debate to some of these issues now, and you were quite direct in talking about it in your opening comments, which was great. There is an ideological debate. You've got the progressive left that views big as bad, and to some degree there's an hostility toward corporations and things that will help corporations, and I think you referred to that very quickly in the section on digital policy, and I think that's why Secretary Raimondo got silenced after she did some very positive things. It certainly pervades the antitrust discussion, and we can talk about that more.
We're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to turn to Shane first to pick up on, in a way, the last thing you said, talk to us a little bit about China. China's government, as we've said, supports its technology giants, Huawei, SMIC, Alibaba. I'm not sure they're supporting Alibaba, but
well, they taught Alibaba a lesson, right? They got out of line and they paid the price for it, and then everybody else paid attention.
Exactly. Anyway, the government supports those big companies in order to modernize and strengthen its commercial and defense sectors. If you look at their plans, their the 14th five-year plan, their new generation AI development plan, the famous Made in China 2025, which has sort of disappeared but is still out there. They're all demonstrate that it's part of their goal to invest in domestic innovation, to develop technology self-reliance and compete with the West globally, which is what I alluded to earlier. What is the best way for the U.S. to approach its own policies vis-a-vis its own tech ecosystem to best compete with that?
I think acknowledging that we are in a competition with China and that we need to be supporting American companies rather than trying to defeat them. I love all these products that they're complaining about because they're wildly successful because people like them. They've taken friction points out of the marketplace that you get so used to things coming to your doorstep and thinking about it and not having to waste your human capital time to go to a store. When you go to a store, you're distracted by design. The people that you talk to at the store generally can't help you because they don't know that much about the products, that if I were back online, I would be able to get a description and I'd be in and out. So I find my time is better spent utilizing a lot of this technology that the Federal Trade Commission is upset about. So China has taken those lessons. The difference there is it's more centralized. And so, they're making decisions about how they want things to move forward. And eventually, as I said, we're going to be buying our technology and our intellectual property from China, which is not something we're expecting to do, or I think a lot of people think about as, individuals or even corporations. But as a government, we should be thinking about that. That do we want to ensure that we are defending the intellectual property, which is a huge problem that people don't understand, which goes back to data protection, is all the information that they're sucking up. They've got the power and the compute to design it to watch and see who's doing what where and how do we get ahead of the power curve and what is it that people want, and then design for that and bring it back into the marketplace. We're currently very good at that, but we're trying to break that machine apart, and I think that's to our detriment.
Shane's point on IP is really important. You might have seen there was a case decided this week in China's favor. So it will be a challenge in the future. I should note, by the way, that we had a dispute over the title. I wanted to call it Wrath of Khan, but apparently there's licensing issues with that. A better title might be America Gets Its Act Together.
Who owns the Wrath of Khan?
Probably Paramount.
Okay, just
but
checking.
This administration, and to some extent its predecessor, have done a good job in turning the tanker in the right direction. So we've seen a lot of progress. The question now is that we've reached this point where this, and I agree with Dorothy, strong ideological dispute where you have ideology, academic theory, versus a very real contest with China that we'll see in the courts over IP, among other places. And that's what we're trying to call attention to, is now may not be the time to take the foot off the gas pedal.
I promised to get back to antitrust, and I want to ask Dorothy about that. That's really at the center of the debate over how to encourage innovation. I think we've already discussed that in some detail. What do you think are areas of improvement for the Biden administration's current antitrust policy direction to ensure that it best supports innovation? Are there a lot of misconceptions right now in Washington today about antitrust policy? You thought we were a bit ambivalent in the paper, so here's your chance to clarify.
Yeah, I think, and I don't disagree with everything that Lina Khan is doing. I thought the non-compete issue, that seemed fine. I think there's a big question about whether she has the authority to do what she's doing, but the merits of it seem reasonable to me. She blocked a defense merger, an effort by Lockheed Martin to take over a missile propulsion company, Aerojet, and that was a 4-0 vote by the FTC. It's a long story. She allowed another merger to go through, or the FTC did, another buyer, L3Harris, of that propulsion company. I don't have a problem with that. I think the way the FTC approached it, people in the defense industry say it has had a very chilling effect because of the way that the nature of the investigations, the length of the investigations. And I think that's what she wanted to have happen. And is that a good thing or not? But I think there is a clear thing going on which fits with your larger narrative. She is targeting big tech. And I want to just read something from Herbert, I think it's pronounced Hovenkamp, who is maybe the premier antitrust scholar. He's a lawyer at Penn Law School. And he says he thinks FTC, to some degree DOJ, is grappling with the wrong things. Which industries should the antitrust authorities pursue? Industries that are characterized by slow growth, oligopoly, rigid market shares, low productivity improvement. In other words, industries that are performing poorly. He goes on to say, with big tech, we are looking at probably the most productive part of the economy. The rate of innovation is high. They spend a lot of money on R&D. They're among the largest patent holders. Very little evidence of collusion. They seem to compete with each other strongly. Doesn't mean they don't do some anti-competitive things, but the whole idea that we should be targeting big tech strikes me as fundamentally wrong-headed, and I think that's where I come from. I think it goes back to this ideological issue that big is bad. I think Joe Biden, in effect, outsourced antitrust policy to Elizabeth Warren and other progressives in Congress. That reflects a lack of priority. He was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee this is an area he knows, but I think this is an area where he is deferring to progressives, and I think it reflects a lack of appreciation of the importance of competition policy to our economy. And let me just say one other thing, because this is what pulled me back into this whole debate fairly recently. Lina Khan is out there telling people, and she appeared on with Jon Stewart and CBS Morning News, and she is saying that Boeing planes are falling from the sky because Boeing hasn't faced competition, and the antitrust authorities haven't been active enough. That is an absurd statement because it ignores Airbus. Airbus and Boeing have been competing head-to-head. It is a natural duopoly market, or at least it has been for the last 3 decades, the production, large commercial aircraft. It is a natural duopoly. Airbus drove McDonnell Douglas out of the market in the late 80s and early 90s. She points to the merger of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas in 1997 as the moment where Boeing solidified its monopoly over commercial aircraft production. McDonnell Douglas was a non-entity by 1987. The Boeing-McDonnell Douglas merger was entirely a defense merger. McDonnell Douglas was a failing firm. The Defense Department needed to keep those activities going, and Boeing was the logical partner because their defense businesses didn't overlap. She somehow sees that merger as giving Boeing a monopoly. It did not. Boeing was the only U.S. commercial manufacturer of any meaning even before that. And then she argues that that led Boeing to cut back on investment in innovation and safety and a number of other things because it did not face competition. It faced huge competition from Airbus. Having driven McDonnell Douglas out of the market, Airbus then went directly after Boeing, and Boeing has lost market share for the 3 decades since. So I think she is operating. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me that the chairman of the FTC is out there saying things like that reflect such a complete misunderstanding of the history, the economics of the industry, the role of scale economies, learning effects. So it makes me wonder, okay, what about these other cases that I don't know as much about? Is there a similar lack of understanding of the industry there?
And I'll note that we had a piece come out, I think it's on this project webpage, on some of the ideological underpinnings of antitrust and going back to Clay Shirky and the Innovator's Dilemma, which was a great book for the 1990s.
And the duopoly is shortly going to become a triopoly, if that's a word, because the Chinese are marketing their own commercial aircraft domestically.
Yes.
And I think it's only a matter of time before will be marketed internationally, and there will be a new competitor. But in a way, what your story reflects what we were saying earlier, that if you think about the market structure solely in the United States,
right,
you miss the point. Now,
right.
50 years ago, 100 years ago, that made perfect sense. But
right.
now the competition is outside the United States, and that's not really competition that we can control.
Staying on aviation for just a second, though, if you kind of want to see where the puck is going, the Middle East and their state-owned airlines are now really eating the Europeans' lunch on anyone going to Asia. You no longer have to fly through London, Frankfurt. You go to Doha, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and this was in the Financial Times last week. It just was sort of a shock to the Europeans that somebody was going to find a way around their routes. And you're going to. I don't care where I fly through. I need to get to an end point. And it's made the entire process, even with all the things that are going on in the middle of the Middle East, people are fine. They fly around it. And so you're seeing it's going to be an interesting, summer for them to have not as many people flying through Frankfurt and London and the other, major places, Paris. Well, you'll have the Olympics going on, but.
If you spend a lot of time in the Frankfurt airport, you'd probably be happy about that.
I do. I'm happy to not go through the Frankfurt airport. However, I just think that was the Europeans not understanding that there was eventually going to be a new level of competition that was coming into the place.
Well, once again, this is all global, not simply continental in their case or domestic in our case. Let me remind the audience that's watching in real time that now is a good time to send questions if you have any. So click on the button on the relevant, the invitation page, and send your question in. Let me go on. Let's talk a little bit about digital trade policy in particular, because we've also alluded to that. And that's another area where there seems to have been a significant shift, although I think if you asked USTR about that, they would say it's not been a shift in the sense that we haven't developed a new policy. Yeah. We've stepped back from the old policy and we are now thinking about what we're going to do. So it's a half a shift, I guess you could say. But you know, I mentioned the Joint Statement Initiative of the WTO. I mentioned the IPEF, their National Trade Estimate Report, which comes out every March, dropped this time around. Did not mention restrictions on cross-border transfer of data as a barrier. Makes no mention of the Europeans' DMA, which is a barrier, as we've been discussing. Any thoughts about why that happened, and also where it's going? And does this really matter from the standpoint of U.S. companies? Do they care? Are they being affected?
Yes. They look for, the lawyers especially, look for where they need to be concerned about the regulatory fires or who's going to be leading them. And since we are not doing that currently here in the United States, to the extent the Federal Trade Commission is doing it, they're doing it in the path that the Europeans have created. It's what we're seeing with artificial intelligence. They're basically bowing down to Brussels to say, what is it that we need to be looking for? Because they just want to build towards what the regulatory guidance is. And if we don't step in and say, we're going to allow you to have, you know, rules that are more U.S. centric, where the Europeans are going to continue to win, the Digital Markets Act is just a huge cash cow for the Europeans. That's the main thing that they're doing there, is they're making a huge, allegations against companies and fining them, and which will eventually probably not work in their favor in the court. But until that point, it's just tangling a lot of money that could be spent on innovation and R&D in the court systems.
To maybe reinforce that point, Europeans don't like the large American service providers, and so occasionally they announce they're going to create a European variant to offer an alternative. So they don't like Google, although it's the preferred search engine. And so they created a European search engine. But to find it, you have to use Google.
You know, the Minitel is still up, I believe, in France.
Is it really? No, I don't think so.
I think you could probably find remnants of it.
We do have some audience questions, I'm glad to say. And let me put a couple of those out for you in the remaining time. This is an interesting one that the paper doesn't address. What role have legacy media businesses played in getting us into our current situation? It seems they have utterly failed as an institution at the same time they are failing as businesses.
Well, they're challenged with what I think of thought bubbles. People stay in the lane of which their information is going to give them a reinforcement that they're right. So the challenge of, for years we had ABC, CBS, and NBC. Maybe, PBS came in as your edgy competitor there. But you were seeing the same information flow, which is still true today. If I walk downstairs every once in a while and I just start flipping through the channels and I see the exact same stories, whether I see it at 6:30 or 7 o'clock. So they've kind of done it to themselves in that space. But part of what they've done is they've broadened with going into more cable operations and individuals and spending that energy where people want to use it, which is very specific channels, the Home and Garden channel, we go back to, I always think, the tennis case, had we known how much it was going to make a difference. But so people are spending their time where they want it to be, and it isn't with the national understanding of 1 or 2 or 3 carriers, and that is replicated on the internet in the way that they use the internet space that they go to. They go to what they like and what makes them feel comfortable.
We've got some other questions that kind of veer into politics and are not exactly on the subject, although at this time of year and in the election year, it's inevitable anyway. So I'm not going to ask all of them. We don't have time for all of them, but I'm going to ask the first one, although I have to say I don't agree with the premise, which is with the U.S. no longer considered a beacon of freedom on the international stage, what consequences do you perceive for countries whose democracy is more fragile than our own, and even those countries that have a long history of democratic tradition, but who rely so heavily upon the U.S. to lead the way?
Do you see immigrants lining up to get into China or Russia, or for that matter, some of the other countries we could think of? we might be a beacon of incompetence, but we're still probably a beacon of freedom too. So I really
didn't agree with the
that.
I didn't agree with the
It's
premise
like,
either.
You know, people vote with their feet, and they're voting to come here, and that's for a reason.
You guys want to say anything?
I can't
No?
top that.
It annoyed the heck out of me.
Okay. Well, there are several other questions that sort of follow along the same lines. Well, here's an interesting one that's also related, not directly on the paper. From a judicial perspective, I'm not sure what that means, how do you view the role of the private sector in upholding constitutional principles and democratic norms?
Wow.
I don't know if they're referring to the Supreme Court cases on First Amendment that are up. It's hard to
I
read
don't
into
know.
that question. That's the only thing that I think is before us. And that I would say is, there's going to your mention that we're in an election year, so disinformation, misinformation, there's a lot of concern about how are we going to detect that and make sure that people understand who is the author of the information that they're seeing come forward. And that's part of the challenge with these Supreme Court cases is if you leave everything up, we don't really have a very consistent net of being able to say that we need to take things down, this is inappropriate, or there was something that was manufactured to sway someone in a persuasion way that is not necessarily backed by fact. If you can't take those things down as a provider of, of the content, you're not the provider of the content, you're the provider of the medium. And if you can't take those things down, that means that you're just going to continue to perpetuate the myths and the lies that people want to put forward. So that will be an interesting set of cases that we'll see this summer.
The only thing I would add is that I think that whole debate about what platforms should take down or not has contributed to a tech backlash or a techlash, which I think together with the big is bad mentality are part of this ideological divide that we have referred to. There is definitely a techlash taking place.
Yet we continue to use the products.
Yes.
And over and over again, increasingly. So this is like the polling about Buy America. Everybody's for Buy American polls. Then they all shop at Walmart and buy imports. So
Well, they're buying it in America.
they're buying it in America,
Right.
yes, but
Right.
it's a good way to put it. But so you're saying we hate big tech, but we use all their products anyway. Is that?
Well, and there's some legitimate things to look at. I mean, some of the recent cybersecurity incidents have an antitrust flavor to them, and so there are legitimate questions, but they're not necessarily, as you were saying, the questions that the FTC is primarily focused on. So
Right.
that would be. We're not saying antitrust is bad. At least I'm not saying antitrust is
No.
bad.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that
Oh,
think
no.
a little bit about the security implications.
Yeah, having a strong competition policy is key to a good economy. I have long been huge fans of the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice, and the FTC. The Antitrust Division was the second most desired place for law graduates to go 30, 40, 50 years ago. Next to clerking for someone on the Supreme Court, going to the Antitrust Division was second on the list. I mean, it's an amazing place, and it's been very staff-driven. And economists have played a very big role. And I didn't mention this. I'm not an economist, but I sometimes play one on TV. And antitrust has basically left economics behind, and that is part of this whole dispute. They've even changed the name of a particular office in the Antitrust Division that had economics in it to get rid of that word. Economists are being left out of the antitrust process.
Well, we are at the end of time. Closing comments, Shane. You want to end up with a minute, or?
I'm on the end of time. I feel like,
Oh, really?
yeah. So I am actually a huge fan of technology, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it can enable us in many ways. I think one of our challenges, we do need to be thinking about workforce all across the board on many things, but we need to be putting the right kids in class to be thinking about these jobs that we need to put it forward so we can be ready for the next decade as we move forward into prosperity, hopefully.
Jim, you want to close us off?
Sure. There's a couple things to look at. We are in a contest with China. The Chinese have significant handicaps, so we don't want to overstate the risk because, you know, they're Marxists. I mean, betting on the great ideological failure of the 20th century. We want to look closely at Europe, and Europe is a precedent for what not to do when it comes to these policies. And if you're curious about that, you can go to the World Bank or the IMF and compare European income growth versus China and the US. And so we need to think carefully in a way now that we didn't used to have to think, that decisions on antitrust, on innovation, on technology have direct national security implications that don't fall in the traditional venue. This is not a DoD issue. And that's why we're talking about FTC and DOJ and others.
And I think the lesson of the paper is that that we really need to look at a lot of these issues from the perspective of national security and thinking about how they affect our security, because we are faced with the kind of challenge both on the economic side and on the foreign policy and defense side from China that we haven't faced before. The Soviet Union was for a strong defense competitor, military competitor. It was never an economic threat to the United States. We went through, those of you that are old as I am remember going through the Japan economic competition crisis in the 80s. Japan was never a national security threat. We are now faced with a situation where we have an adversary that is both. And that means we have to change the way we think about a lot of what we do. It's produced the change in industrial strategy that Dorothy talked about quite eloquently. It has not produced a change in antitrust thinking, which is, in fact, if anything, it's gotten more problematic rather than better. And that one of the things, I think the main thing the paper recommends is that the competition authorities really need to keep the international context and the security issues in mind when they decide how to proceed. And so with that, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And please go to the website, either the Security and Technology Policy or the Scholl Chair. I think it's in both places. Go there and get the paper and read it, and we will welcome your email comments after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.